Welcome. My name is Hua Chen, Columbia class of 1992. I'm co-chair of the Alumni Engagement Committee and a member of the Intellectual Committee for Programming, and executive board member of the Columbia College Alumni Association, CCAA. This event is brought to you by CCAA. Big Topics is a virtual series of short lectures on a variety of topics related to current affairs and texts from the core curriculum. Alumni will have the opportunity to learn and discuss enduring topics like morality, humanity, and justice. This semester's theme is on civil disobedience. The concept of this hour is to try and recreate the core curriculum discussion as an experiment among a diverse collection of alumni for fun and for interest. Professor Neer, also known as Bob, was a Harvard undergrad class of 1986. He enjoyed a Fulbright scholarship to study political science at National University of Singapore and then received a JD and a U.S. History PhD with Columbia with honors in international and comparative law. His dissertation on napalm, published by the Belknap Press of Harvard University, is essential reading for those interested in understanding military history and the history of American military power. Bob taught CC from 2006 to 2014 as a preceptor and core lecturer and was awarded the Faculty Award for Teaching Excellence from the core office. I'm super excited that Bob's here. He's one of the best CC teachers I think Columbia has had. Since then, he's taught a summer course from the Empire of Liberty, a global history of the U.S. military, as a lecturer for the history department at Columbia. He's currently a professor of the global business and law at the Holt International School in Cambridge, Massachusetts, an avid runner, a border collie dog owner, and a devoted soccer dad to two terrific kids. Before we get started, please note, if you have a question, please enter your name and your graduating year into the chat on the bottom of your screen. Your entry will only be visible to our super talented, multitasking Director of Alumni Relations, Than D. Pennant. If your question is selected, we'll ask for your question on your behalf. You feel free to submit questions at any time throughout the presentation, and for optimal view, please enter full screen mode. Welcome, Professor Neer. Take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Hua. It's a delight to be introduced by you. Hua and I have known each other for a very long time, and we met at Columbia, so it's been a friendship of many decades. It's delightful to be here with everybody. I love Columbia. I had a great time teaching contemporary civilization. I've taught a lot of classes since that time. But that's really the one that I think I love the best because it's so interesting to talk about these cosmic issues in a very contemporary context. I would always tell my students that they're contemporary and the curriculum is the civilization and the class is where the two meet. So over the years, I've had many wonderful discussions and stay in touch with a lot of my students, and I hope we can try to recreate that here in the brief time that we have together. So I made a little presentation for you, which I will share here and just talk through as we go along. As Hua mentioned, you can participate in the chat, and then we're also going to have breakout rooms and a good chance for everybody here to talk. The way I always like to start my CC classes, remember you've got a group of undergraduates. They are adults, but they're not really ground down yet by the world, so they're very optimistic and imaginative, and you can learn a tremendous amount from them. I usually start the classes with a question. So we're going to talk about civil disobedience today. The question I would ask them today would be, what would you get arrested for? In a class, a CC class, you have a chance to go around. So I see, for example, Wade and Lisa here, Jonathan, Kate, Carlos, Adlar, you could each answer that. And that's really good for a class because then you can actually see the people and they have to sort of think about it a little bit. And it's a pretty serious thing to get arrested. So you could answer that in the chat if you like, but that's just a little kind of memory of what those classes might be like. As I mentioned, to just describe what we're going to be doing over the next hour, we've got let's go through here, about 20 minutes for me to give you an overview about Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham Jail. Then we'll have about 20 minutes for breakout room discussions. So we'll split you up into smaller groups. I'll kind of travel around and say hi in each one and answer any questions, but it's a chance for you to talk about some aspects that you might find interesting. Doubtless everybody on this call has already assiduously read the materials for today, just like in every Columbia class. But it sometimes happens that students don't always read everything as carefully as they would like. That's one of my things that I always try to teach them. Never say you didn't do the reading. Always say I wasn't able to do the reading as carefully as I would have liked. Maybe, I don't know, that's the lawyer in me. So we'll have a little time for breakout discussions. If you had a chance to look at it, that's great. If you have some opinions on what we're talking about, that's also great. And then we'll come back here, and the people from the breakout rooms can maybe advance one or two key points that they want to advance on behalf of their group, and we'll talk about some of those ideas as well. Remember, the idea for CC is different than most university classes. Typically, at a wonderful university like Columbia, you find a world expert in particle physics or in some aspect, let's say the US Civil War or some part of history, and then that expert teaches what they know. But CC is different. They hire, first of all, I remember when I was starting out as a teacher, I was kind of terrified by the experience. And Phil Kitcher, who was the head of the philosophy department and the chair of contemporary civilization when I was there, said, nobody is an expert here. You've got 2,500 years of U.S. history, of world history. Nobody knows, nobody can be a scholar of the Bible and the Quran and Immanuel Kant and Adam Smith. So it's really kind of like modeling what an educated person might think about these different texts. At least that's the way I always taught the class. And so I tried to do that for you too. I reread this material last night, finished at around 2:30, and put this presentation together. So you are getting very much of the CC experience, at least from me. We're going to talk about the letter from Birmingham Jail. I know that the advertisement also talked about Gandhi's writings, and I'm very happy. I'll put my email up at the end. Anybody who wants to talk about that later on, I'd be delighted to talk about it with you. But we only have 1 hour, and normal CC class is 2 hours. So we're just going to, I think, for a better experience for everybody, focus on King's letter from Birmingham Jail. I'll tell you a little bit about myself because I do think it's important to know who the instructor is. You get a lot more out of the material that way. My students, obviously for CC, you know them really well because you spend a lot of time together. So we can't have that, but at least I'll give you a little bit of background. As Wah said, I'm a professor of global business and law at this new business school in Cambridge, Mass. I teach about global business law, business and the world economy, startups, business of art. I really do like art a lot, global citizenship, and other things like that. I went to Harvard College undergraduate. I'm from Cambridge. I'm a Red Sox fan, which actually ultimately led to our return to Boston. I know. Good luck to all of you in the World Series. I went to the National University of Singapore, went to law school at Columbia, which I loved. I also then, after a 14-year leave of absence between law school and getting my PhD, came back and got my U.S. History PhD. The book about napalm was published, as well mentioned, by Harvard University Press. And I would say that my basic academic expertise is in global U.S. military power. That 14-year leave of absence, I spent starting and developing and selling a lot of different businesses in the West End and in London, West End and Broadway theater business, in Los Angeles, an Asian television distribution company, in Singapore, regional television distribution business, in Hong Kong, an Asian media consulting company, and a streaming video business in Boston. At Columbia, my teaching experience, as you heard, was contemporary civilization, which again, I loved, intellectual experience of a lifetime, 2006 to 2008 and 2011 to 2014. So I've taught a couple of hundred Columbia undergraduates contemporary civilization over a full year, twice a week, 2 hours every time. And from 2014 to the present, I've been teaching in the university in the summers for the history department, a class called Empire of Liberty, a global history of the US military. It's really fun, really exciting, action-packed, all of America's wars in one summer class. Lots and lots of interesting students have come through that class. As you doubtless know, Columbia has a close connection in many ways to the US military. And so there's a lot of history, including the atomic bomb. So that's an interesting course. Just in terms of discussion, I always tell my students that when we come to a difficult issue, we should go towards it, not away from it. It's great experience to talk about difficult topics. I remind everybody that this is academic discussion, it's not personal. So I would advise it staying away from personal elements of this discussion and focusing on the academic side of them. Martin Luther King, for a CC class, it's good to give the students a little bit of background about the kind of history of the person. So he was born in 1929, year of the crash in Atlanta. A family of preachers. His dad and grandfather were both ministers. He was a skeptic at the age of 13. He denied the resurrection. He's like, seems improbable. So a very kind of active mind. He went to Booker T. Washington High School, where he skipped the 9th and 12th grades. These kinds of details often resonate a lot with undergraduates who have themselves just survived American high school or high school someplace. When he was 15, he enrolled at Morehouse College, which is in Atlanta, and majored in sociology. And then he went on for advanced studies in theology. He got his divinity bachelor's degree from Crozer University, which is in Pennsylvania. That was a little of his higher education. When he was 24, he got married. Again, that's an age that will really hit an audience of 19 and 20-year-olds. That's only like 4 or 5 years older than they typically are. Maybe many of you have already passed that milestone. He got married to a woman named Coretta Scott King at her parents' house in Alabama. And then when he was 25, he became a pastor as his job at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, which is in Montgomery, Alabama. But he continued to study. He got his PhD at Boston University in 1955. King wasn't a perfect person. His PhD was subsequently determined by BU to have extensive elements of plagiarism in it, but they ultimately decided not to take action. They said it had provided a useful contribution. Hey, Joanna, I see one of my former students entering our classroom. So she can provide, she can tell you all the back details, anything I skip. He became a national leader during the civil rights movement. That began earlier in U.S. history, but one of the most famous initial elements of that movement was the Montgomery bus boycott, where Rosa Parks famously refused to give up her seat and was arrested. It was a 385-day boycott. King's house was bombed. He was arrested. There was tremendous violent response in the civil rights movement to the drive for equality between races. In 1956, the federal district court in Alabama ended bus segregation, so the bus boycott was successful in that limited context. And in 1957, King and others founded an organization called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So observe that it's specifically Christian. It was, this is a reverend, a minister, the Christian Leadership Conference. They would be built around Black churches, adopted the principle of nonviolence, of course, influenced by Gandhi and others that we can talk about by email or later on if you're interested, and focus on civil rights. King was the leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And just to give you a kind of reminder that there have been many other fraught periods, like the election that we're about to experience next week in U.S. history, the 1960 election between Kennedy and Nixon was incredibly close, very, very evenly split country. And it was at the same time that King was leading nonviolent protests focused across the South, sit-ins, lunch counter sit-ins, and other forms of civil disobedience that often produced very violent responses. King was himself jailed during this time for 4 months of hard labor, which prompted an intervention by national politicians and a lot of focus and energy, on these activities. He was ultimately released after 4 days, and in that election, John Kennedy from Massachusetts won. The Birmingham campaign was a specific campaign aimed at ending segregation in Birmingham. It included nonviolent marches and sit-ins. Bull Connor was the chief law enforcement officer there, and he responded with a great deal of violence, water jets, very, very high-powered hoses that could even blast bricks out of buildings at a certain distance, and dogs, which were captured in many images. So this is a famous image from that time. King was himself jailed. That was the 13th arrest of 29 over his participation in this movement. And it was at that point that he wrote this document that we're going to look at in a little bit more detail. The epilogue to the story is that on August 28th in 1963, the March on Washington took place. That's where King made his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, and that was the kind of the memorial that I showed you at the beginning of the talk. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, year I was born, which was made him the youngest recipient of that prize until Malala Yousafzai won it recently. In 1967, to bring it really close to Columbia, and you cannot get closer to a lot of these historical events than New York in general and Columbia in particular, he gave a talk at Riverside Church called Beyond Vietnam, where he expanded the kind of civil rights movement into a movement against, at least articulated an expansion of it, not just focused on civil rights, but also opposed to the Vietnam War and economic justice, the so-called Poor People's Campaign. And in 1968, he was assassinated at this spot at the Lorraine Motel. Kennedy was killed in 1963, and Robert Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother, in 1968. So as I said, we'll have a chance to break out and talk about this book. I'll just go through in a couple minutes some of the things that I thought were key points. That's the way I always like to teach CC, was give people a little bit of background. And then, as I mentioned, since as I understand it, part of the purpose of the course is just to show how your instructor responds to these documents without being an expert. So some of the key points that I thought when I was reading through this document, which I've read before, but last night for you all, late at night. First of all, it was generated by a letter to King by a group of white clergymen. They issued this letter on April 12th, and they basically told him that he should pull back from this campaign in Birmingham. That was a call for unity, is what they called it. And they focused on outsiders coming into Birmingham, leading protests as they saw it, and said that the protesters should go through the courts, not the streets, in their drive to end segregation. He wrote this document initially on newspaper margins, first notes on the actual margin of the newspaper that contained that letter from those white clergymen, paper scraps that a prison attendant brought him, and ultimately a legal pad that his lawyer was able to give him, which also kind of is a point about the changes in technology, between that time and now, no cell phones or internet. The document, the New York Times didn't want to publish it initially when it was offered to them, and so it was first published in New York Post, Sunday Magazine, some excerpts, and then the American Friends Service Committee, which of course is a religiously based group, was the first group that actually published it in full. So I kind of just broke up some of the passages that I thought were interesting, and maybe we'll go just a couple minutes over the 20 here, but not a lot. Theory, his big theory is that everybody is connected to each other. He says, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. So it's very eloquent, but the basic idea is that people are connected. Anyone who lives inside the United States, he says, can never be considered an outsider. In terms of the practice, and of course, New York's a very practical city in many ways, so I used a picture there of this beautiful city. He says there are 4 basic steps for a nonviolent campaign of civil disobedience. First, you have to collect the facts to determine whether injustices are alive. Then you have to engage in negotiation. Then you have to conduct a self-purification, sort of spiritual self-purification, and then you can take action. He says that the means that are used have to be as pure as the ends that we seek. It's wrong to use immoral means to attain moral ends, but he also says that it is just as wrong, or even more wrong, to use moral means to preserve immoral ends. The purpose of this kind of activity, for example, civil rights protests in the streets, sit-ins at lunch counters, chaining yourself to a door or whatever, is that it seeks to create such a crisis and establish such creative tension, that a community that has consistently refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. The goal is negotiation, he says in this letter. And he says it has to be active. So we know through painful experience, there's a little bit of history, that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. So if you don't do anything, you won't create any change. There's another section that, and I tried mostly to go through chronologically through the document, but there's a next section that talks a lot about law. So here's our beloved law school, and the Pegasus being tamed by Bellerophon in front of that building. I think this is really interesting. A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law, or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that's out of harmony with the moral law. So he really is a reverend. He's steeped in Christian practice, and he kind of appeals to the law of God or a moral law, which I think is quite useful to maybe think about and to discuss. An unjust law, he says, is a code that a majority inflicts on a minority that's not binding on itself. It's really a kind of version of the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And that, he says, is difference made legal. So I suggested different kind of questions you might consider during the breakouts, but it's worth considering that undocumented migrants, for example, are people that live in the United States but are not treated the same. And you wonder whether that's moral or immoral or just or unjust. Our wonderful library here, I love the top: a man is but what he knoweth, should of course be a person is but what they knoweth, but plenty of sexism in our history to work our way through. Anyway, the authorities here, he cites the Bible and Socrates. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar. The early Christians, he said, were willing to face hungry lions. And academic freedom, he argues, is a reality today because Socrates practiced civil disobedience, underlining how valuable it is to take the core. Because if you don't take the core, you don't understand about Socrates, you wouldn't really understand the kind of strength of these arguments or what he's trying to say. Extremists that he cites as examples for his own actions are Jesus, Amos, Paul, Martin Luther, John Bunyan, Abraham Lincoln, and Thomas Jefferson. I think lots of food for thought there too. Very overwhelmingly religious people that he's citing as his kind of like inspirations. He's not citing entrepreneurs. He's not citing physicists, and also, of course, includes slaveholder Thomas Jefferson at the end there. He says that the nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed toward the goal of political independence, and we still creep at horse and buggy pace toward the gaining of a cup of coffee at a lunch counter. So he puts it in a global context, not just related to the United States. And he makes a very emotional discussion of what it's like to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to a public amusement park that's just been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her little eyes when she's told that Funtown is closed. I always think that line, like Funtown is closed, is a really one that I always kind of carry away and remember. And then he finally finishes up with politics. He says that he's gravely disappointed in white moderates, who he thinks are what he says is, I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride to freedom is not the white citizens counselor, which were these racist white citizens groups, or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who's more devoted to order than to justice, which is quite an extreme statement in its own way. White moderates are a bigger stumbling block than the KKK, and I think maybe a good topic to discuss in the breakout groups. The contemporary church, he says, is so often a weak and ineffectual voice with an uncertain sound. It's so often the arch supporter of the status quo. And of course, as we know, we live in the United States in a time when there are big changes in religious belief in the population, including a kind of quite precipitous decline in religious observance by younger people, and a rise just over the last couple decades in people who don't have any particular religious denominational affiliation. The last point I think is worth mentioning, and then we'll go to the breakout rooms here, is hope. This is, of course, a picture of the sundial in the center of the campus. He says, we'll reach the goal of freedom in Birmingham and all over the nation because the goal of America is freedom. And I think it's also good to think to yourself if that's the goal that you see of America, or maybe there's more than one goal. But he says it's the goal. It's the only one goal, and the goal of America is freedom. I just wanted to play you 30 seconds of King's voice because you can actually hear, with the technology that we have, the YouTube and videos and everything, you can hear the entire speech. So if you're walking your dog or walking around or taking a jog in Central Park or something, you can listen to King. It's about a 50-minute talk.
That all activity is unwise and untimely. Seldom do I pause to answer criticism of my work and ideas. If I sought to answer all the criticisms that crossed my desk, my secretaries would have little time for anything other than such correspondence in the course of the day.
The last point to carry away is that King's voice was not the only voice during the civil rights movement and during this time. Malcolm X, for example, one of the most prominent of the Black Muslim organization, criticized this little passive resistance or wait until you change your mind and then let me up philosophy. He said anybody can sit, it takes a man to stand. So it's worth remembering that it's good to talk about this document on its own terms, but I think also in a broader context and even in the context of this entire country. So I think we'll go to breakout rooms. I'll come around and visit you all, and you can kind of react with your own thoughts about some of the text we talked about. And then after 15 or 20 minutes together in those smaller groups, we'll come back and listen to what the individual groups came up with and sort of try to recreate the fun of a CC discussion seminar in the 40 minutes that we have. Excellent. So thank you so much, Tandi, for managing everybody in the background. This is an experiment. We're trying to see how this might most effectively proceed. But the idea that we had thinking about how to manage this was that perhaps the moderators of each breakout group or somebody from that breakout group chosen by the moderators could articulate maybe one or two of the most interesting ideas that they came up with as a way to kick things off. So I don't know, John, do you have something from your group or Wah or somebody else?
Sure, I can give a couple that came from our group, and we had a bunch, but I'll pick two.
Yeah, and I think people in the panel, just like in a CC class, I mean, okay, there's a lot of people here, but you know, if it resonates with you or there's something from the document, one technique that I would often use in classes would be to kind of prevent people from just going off the rails is to say, like, where in the document do you see that? So if you hear something that's going on and you find a passage, that can be very constructive to reference it and to read it.
So one of the points that came up had to do with the section in the letter, which talked about moral law versus unjust and just laws, and how do you distinguish what's a just law and unjust law? Because that's the whole touchstone for when you can engage in civil disobedience. And one of our group's participants raised the point. The point came up that, well, how do you determine what's moral and not moral? Because this whole idea of what God wants is not necessarily agreed upon. But one of our participants was pointing out, look, even though there are sometimes differences, most people, a very large consensus exists on a lot of things in terms of morality and immorality. You're talking about the fringes when you get into disagreements as to what God's law or moral law is or isn't. Which I thought was an interesting point. It was more in defense of King's structure as to how to define whether laws are just or unjust. The second thing that came up in the discussion was related to King's discussion of white moderates and his frustration with them and his comparison of them with Klansmen, saying that he's almost ready to believe that they're worse than Klansmen. In that discussion, one of our participants pointed out, interestingly, that the whole tenor of it was this whole struggle doesn't have to go just one way. It's not inevitable that justice is going to happen, because if people don't get up and say something and speak up and engage in this civil disobedience, it can remain this way. Segregation can continue for a very long time. So there was a certain exhortation on the part of King that moderates have to step up and be heard. Otherwise, this battle can be lost. I thought both points were very interesting.
Anybody in the group want to weigh in on that, or perhaps in the chat comments? You can raise your hand as a way to address that. There's also, of course, this interlocking idea to the point of John of how you tell when a law is moral or immoral, when he makes the comparison, sort of a version of the golden rule from the Bible, from the book of Matthew: treat others as you would have them treat you. But of course, who's going to make that decision? Like, sure, treat me like that, you know? I mean, so you get to a point of actual participation as being the best evidence of people's commitment. Kurt, did you have any points that you wanted to raise from your group? Or yeah, sure, Bodan.
Sure. Well, there's a very interesting course that's taking place at Yale, and there's a Columbia professor who is quoted in that course, and I've actually followed her. I think it's Professor McMurray, and she says, and let's talk about Martin Luther King and Du Bois and all that, and Du Bois, that the Confederacy was an illegal, treasonous rebellion based on white supremacy and slavery. And if you look at the protests at Columbia in 1968, and I'm from the class of 68, white supremacy was created by the Columbia University Dunning School. And there's an intrinsic racism in Columbia's history that really we did not understand in the class of 68.
Okay. Yeah, the Dunning School was this theory that the reason that Reconstruction failed after the Civil War was because of incompetence by Black elected officials and corruption, and created at Columbia, but also my beloved professor Eric Foner helped to destroy the Dunning School by arguing that that wasn't a correct interpretation, and Reconstruction was better seen as a lost opportunity that then was, after a brief flowering of opportunity in the South, lost for a century, to very much to the point that you were making, John, that these systems can take a very long time. You know, it may be that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice, another quote by King, but maybe not in our lifetime. All of us here at the moment only have 70 according to the Bible, or maybe we get a little bit longer with modern medicine, but not an indefinite period. Kurt, were you gonna find something perhaps from your group?
Yeah, actually, in the letter from Birmingham Jail, although he says elsewhere that the arc of the universe, the moral arc of the universe is positive, tends toward justice. He does say that time is neutral, right in the letter, and that really it is only through direct action, right, our agency in alignment with a higher law, with the higher moral law of the universe, that arc actually gets actualized. I think that's implicit in his statement, that time itself is neutral, and it's really through our agency that it bends toward justice.
Was your interpretation then, or that of your group, that was the essence or an important element of his complaint about white moderates, because they were sort of like slowing things down, as it were?
We didn't do that. I was just adding that, just based on what John and had just said in the discussion we had. But in our group, when we took up the point about moderates, Jonathan Friedman really reflected on the fact that again, Columbia was a very vocal voice of that moderation during that period of time. Lionel Trilling and Hofstadter, right? Great intellectuals of the university at that point in time were actually part of that. I think Jonathan used the word, that mushy middle, right? Which might seem sensible, but and we reflected a little bit on, well, but there are circumstances, perhaps longstanding again, because time is neutral without agency. There are circumstances where that's no longer a coherent, legitimate stance, and civil disobedience becomes absolutely necessary in order to reinitiate the possibility of negotiation.
Yeah, at this point, I would usually exhort my students to go do stuff. Yeah, go out there. You've got, the time is important, and I think in my experience, 19 and 20-year-olds tend to feel that really, really passionately, which is one reason it's so fun to spend time with them. Wow, what were you gonna maybe offer from your group?
We had Jen from the class of 1996 and Steve Chernin discussing the pacing of violence versus nonviolence. We had two crew members from the class of 1968 and 1973 who lived through and were exposed to earlier protests, and pointed out that protests are emotional and solutions are intellectual. We could have used a lot more time because people were interested in how that connected to solving or addressing protests that are happening right now on campus. But tangentially, I want to also point out that we also know that King wasn't the first to muse about justice from jail. You had Socrates, who did it in Plato's Apology, and you had Henry David Thoreau do it on civil disobedience. So perhaps maybe if we threw some protesters in jail, we'd get more, concrete solutions.
And then, excellent. Splendid. Thanks. So our system appears perhaps a little bit to be working. Basically, this is the same as the national system of government that we have. There's a kind of form of representative democracy in which individuals speak on behalf of their groups, but we have a nice direct path here. So I want to encourage you guys to just, Grayson or Sherry or Jonathan or Jeremy, Jen, you can just unmute or like raise your hand or wave your arms about to get some attention.
Oh, I think we
Well,
skipped
Joanne,
our
we had,
first-
yeah.
And I was going to call on my colleagues, Adler and Tom Doherty. We definitely could have used more time because I think we were just excited as alumni to be together and to talk about our paths and our lives post college. But we were talking mainly about Adlar gave us we're talking about just points that impacted us, and one question that Bob had suggested was like why the Birmingham campaign was successful. What was it about it? And then Tom remarked, we were talking about the question about connection. Where it really does that led to the famous quote that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And he was saying, I'm in Atlanta, but why would I not care about what's happening in Birmingham? And that anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider. So, these are things that we're thinking about now in the world. Like, should we care about things happening across the world, or are we caring about things only that affect our own lives? So if I can call on both of them just to quickly make the points that you suggested. Adler?
To that point, it goes to that, it draws to that famous quote where we say, out of sight, out of mind. And so, we don't think about it, we don't see it, we don't think it's a problem and so forth. So I think the Birmingham takeover and the protests and the sit-ins and everything nationally that just went, a larger scale really brought forth the impact that people now needed to face it because they were just seeing it. So I think that was a really more important point of how we think the movement was so successful because people came out. I mean, they blocked Birmingham. People came out, thousands of students came out to protest and so forth. So there was a large mass that really people need to confront and realize that was an issue and so forth. So we thought that was definitely an amazing strategy because as the Professor Neer mentioned, so like, if 5 of us were walking down New York City street, protesting and so forth, we would just think it's a normal day in New York City. And, we would just laugh and not even think twice, but, thousands and maybe 10,000s of people were protesting. And so then you were considered like, what's going on and so forth. And so that was a really interesting point we were talking about.
Thank you. Tom, if you're on.
Yes. Yes, sorry, I had to step away to help my daughter get off to school here in Portland, Oregon. Remind me my teacher, remind me my question.
Oh, yes. No, sorry. You were just, I think we had actually discovered that 2 of our 9 participants are podcasters. And so Tom mentions that he has a podcast about climate change and extrapolated that, our world is interconnected in many ways, not actually connected to this text, but as far as global climate change. That's what struck you about that quote.
Yeah, as I was saying, I'm working on a manuscript about helping the public cope with climate change, and I'm grappling with how to address civil disobedience as one of the actions that people would take, and it brings us to this, I think, timeless these timeless principles. And I think the moderate, the waiting, there's a direct analogy to the messaging around climate change, and then we have to wait and we have to work through the systems while many people realize it's a crisis and we need to act now. So I think there's a very clear analogy to what was going on in the early civil rights movement, and a lot of people are working on different levels. So yes, it's really a good synchronicity, to be reading this now. We could assign it in any climate change class and have students grapple with this topic. And the podcast is called Climate Change and Happiness, climatechangeandhappiness.com, and I do it with a colleague from Finland who's an emotions researcher, and it's about your mental health and your coping. We talk about spirituality, the arts, daily life, parenting, et cetera, et cetera. So great talk.
Tom, I was wondering, just as a quick follow-up there, what do you think about, I mean, the kind of the globalization? I think about it sometimes, and then, but King in his letter talks about justice as being limited by national boundary. He says that it's only fair for people that are living in the United States. So the place that I had gone there, I sort of said, what about undocumented migrants or tourists, people that are living here who aren't given the full rights of citizenship? But do you think that maybe that's kind of outdated or not completely responsive to the issue that you raised, which is that climate change affects everybody? It doesn't matter if you live in the United States or not. If China builds a new coal-fired power plant every week, that affects people here, whether they are physically present in the boundaries of the United States nation state.
Exactly. I mean, the global atmosphere is a commons, and so I think the analogy in the letter would be that he says, what's happening in Atlanta and Birmingham, I need to be in Birmingham. So that's the way we would think about it globally. I think what's happening in North Carolina is happening in Portland. So I think we have the short answer is yes, the nation boundaries are not relevant for climate change. It's a global commons, and so it's more like expanding the King's nation to the globe. That's the way I would think about it.
Yeah, of course, laws are still very much nation driven. So
we do want to be mindful.
Well, whether they're moral or right is the question, though.
Good point.
We do want to be mindful of everyone's time and the lunch hour. I think Lisa Carnoy, who is class of 89 and a trustee at Columbia, aptly said, Bob, how can we recruit you back to Columbia College full time to teach? So
Well,
on behalf of CCAA, a big thanks to Professor Bob Neer for your wisdom, agility of mind, scholarship, and time. And thank you all for participating in Big Topic Short Takes and keeping your core alive with examining morality, humanity, and justice. Special thanks to Thandi, our Director of Alumni Relations, for her able assistance and execution of this series, and our outgoing, wonderful CCA President, Sherry Wolf, and our awesome intellectual programming co-chairs, Joanne Kwong and Kurt Rolos. Today is a good day to have a good day, and we have started off great together.
Thank you.
Thank you.